you for joining us for today's Wired seminar. And thank you, Dr. Divya, for presenting today. Dr. Divya is a professor at the Department of City and Metropolitan at the University of Utah. And we are pleased to have her for leading this presentation. The topic of her presentation is the challenge and opportunity of land use planning for wildfire resilience. The floor is yours, Dr. Divya, and please go ahead when you are ready.
Thank you, Fatma. Thank you for inviting me. I am also associated with the Wired Global Center as a co-PI, so it's really nice to see everybody's face here. Some of you we have met earlier. I am an urban planner by training and by profession, which means that I spend a lot of time thinking about how communities should be built or how they should be set up to be more resistant or resilient to disasters in the long term and not just the short term. And so just marrying my profession, concerns for communities' long-term futures, along with what hazards present for us as a challenge, which is also trying to prevent long-term impacts. It has been a very interesting process. And so I'm going to be talking today about a specific type of thing, which is land use planning, and used specifically in the context of wildfire resilience. Now, some of this stuff is going to be not news to you because it has made news already. We are seeing increasingly not just a growing threat of wildfires in the western regions of our countries, but also a departure, if you will, of some of the traditional mechanisms in which we depend on to protect us. So insurance, for example, which is a very highly used form of mitigation measures, how we protect our communities and ourselves against wildfires. And this is home insurance, not necessarily hazards insurance. Welcome companies that offer these are actually leaving specific areas. And, lest we think this is just a California problem, and California is a very good example of where that's happened. You don't have to have had a major wildfire for homeowner insurance companies to decide they no longer want to insure you because you live in a wildfire country. Now, there are households in Salt Lake City who have been denied denied homeowners insurance because they live in the wildland urban area. And so we are increasingly going to face this problem of no longer having the net safety of the kinds of mechanisms we used, insurance being a really good one. At the same time, if we can't protect ourselves before the disaster, one would hope that we could protect ourselves after the disaster, but that is also not quite happening. I'm sorry, I think my screen is a little frozen, so let me see if I can pick this up. We are also seeing a systematic dismantling of the federal structures that we depend on for post-disaster aid. So if you thought, wow, I can't protect myself before the disaster, insurance would have gotten me money at least the government is going to give me some sort of aid. It's not true. The long-term offices that do long-term recovery at the federal level have been quite thoroughly dismantled. And you can see the news yourself, the programs that fund recovery for us at a community scale that actually provide the funding for you to rebuild your house or repair your house are also just going away. They are being delayed in some cases, and just in other cases, there's just no money there. And so there is from both ends, before the disaster and after the disaster, a sort of lessening or diminishing of resources that one can depend on, right, for this purpose. So land use as a solution provides one way out, because land use is about how communities build themselves in response to ecological constraint. And so there is this opportunity for land use to provide an answer where you cannot traditionally protect yourself through, say, money or through recovery grants, to ask ourselves, are we building this right? If we built this slightly differently, this being our homes, our communities, would we have a better chance of withstanding a disaster? And that would lessen the need for dependence on these other mechanisms. So land use provides that kind of avenue, right? A means of doing or achieving the same goals, which is safety and resilience, without necessarily depending on those traditional tools. What land use is essentially a long-range strategy for how we use space within our communities. This is a process that involves understanding what the ecological setting of a community is and to make decisions about where to locate what in our community so that they make the best use of that environment, but also protect themselves against the risks posed by that environment. And importantly, land use provides an opportunity to think both short-term and long-term. It has that the capacity for us to consider what are the goals that we want to do, or what are the things that we want to achieve in the next 5 years, but also what are the goals that we want to achieve for our community in 20 years from now. So to really have that long-range thinking. Importantly, it is also adaptive. Land use planning is not just a one and done kind of a deal. Communities often do their land use planning again and again and again. They revise their land use plans every 5 years. Sometimes they revise it every 10 years. The point is that this accommodates changing environmental or ecological contexts. And so as such, land use has the potential for us to ask ourselves, what is the continual risk that wildfires pose for our community? How should we design our communities to be better resilient? And then as those risks change, how can we change our actions in response to this? And to do all this, not losing sight of the things that we want for our community. For example, we might want our community to do very well economically. So how can we then balance what we want in terms of economic growth and vitality with the risks that these hazards are posing to us? Incidentally, land use planning is already very commonly used for things like flood planning. It's very common for communities in floodplains to think about land use, but not so much in wildfires, as we will find here. Now, land use has a lot of potential, but it doesn't mean that it is always adopted. And a lot of the reasons why land use is not adopted at the local level is because of political unwillingness. Sometimes it requires making decisions about what to leave green and what to build on, and it doesn't always go down very well. In general, in the Western United States region, and that's our study area here, there is a tendency to not have a lot of policy regulation play at the local level, and land use is fundamentally a policy regulation. But as we point out here, there's also a lot of potential here, and we should probably be thinking about, especially given the lack of other mechanisms to protect ourselves, we should probably be thinking of ways to do other things or how we can prevent ourselves. I'm sorry for my hand going up. I have no reason for the hand going up. It's just my Zoom. So what is land use? We have talked a lot about land use, but let's talk about land use in the process of using for wildfires. I'm having some issues with Zoom right now, so please just bear with me. But here it is. When you do, and this is part of the study that we did, when you do a good comprehensive literature review of the types of strategies that communities can use for land use, we come up with 5 major categories of land use. They go from vegetation management, which is about trying to remove or take out the fuel reduction, for example, take out fuel from our surrounding natural environment that would prevent the wildfire from being catastrophic or from spreading too quickly into the community. So the kinds of strategies that fit in here would be things like defensible space strategies or fire breaks or fuel management. Then there are building level regulations that we can adopt. So these are things that we would require buildings and building construction to adopt during the process of retrofit or construction or even maintenance. This could include things like use of fire-safe materials or having ordinances for fire alarms or having sprinklers, etc. This essentially actions that you would take at the building level to make the building a lot more resistant or resilient to disasters. Then there are subdivision regulations, things that we do to clusters of buildings. Subdivisions classically are planning units that when developers build housing, they typically do it at the subdivision level. And so these are clusters of residential units, sometimes with commercial, sometimes with more types of users in them. So this kind of a strategy thinks about the patterns and the layout of that subdivision and ways that we can actually design the location or the siting of our buildings to make it more resilient. And here we would think a lot more about like lot or block design, how we should cluster our buildings, whereas have them spread out, what should be the evacuation or access, or what kind of wildfire regulations homeowner associations can or should be adopting. And then there are zoning regulations, which takes you one level even higher. This is at the community level. And this is to understand overall in the community, what is the land, how we should site residential versus, say, the downtown, what should be the density of these kinds of various uses, or heights of these buildings. And the kinds of strategies that come under zoning regulations would be things like building setbacks or trying to think about densities. Densities would be how many units you can build at any one location, for example. But defensible space zones for the entire community, or even fuel modification zones. So wherever we think of large zones in the community, zoning regulations are where that would go. And then the fifth kind of strategy is really a very long-range thinking strategy. And this is less about what a building looks like or what a lot looks like. It would be more like, should we be building here, right? And so thinking about developing or preserving specific types of lands as a way to prevent destruction. A classic example here would be property buyout. A property buyout would be to offer a homeowner that might be living in a high-risk zone a way to move into the low-risk zone and through monetary compensation. And in some cases, a lot owner, if you own a property right in a remote location, you could give them equal development rights within a more clustered zone of your community, so that in lieu of building there, they would build elsewhere. They would still own the land. And so there are many similar ways or similar types of policy mechanisms in planning that allow planners and for community members to decide how and where to direct growth in their community. And so these kinds of strategies we're calling land preservation and risk management strategies. And they've been used quite successfully in other kinds of hazards, such as floods and hurricanes and tsunami zones. And so these are land use options that are available to wildfire prone communities. The question has always been, how much are wildfire communities really adopting these kinds of strategies as opposed to other strategies? So here is a study, the main study that we did. We asked ourselves, to what extent, do Western region counties, and Western region we define in the US as being the census Western region, which is all the way from Texas to Washington. And we are asking, to what extent do these high-risk wildfire communities adopt land use plannings and their mitigation plans? This was the first study that we did, which was mitigation plans. This has been a following up study that we did about recovery plans. I'll come to that later. So in this study, what we did is we picked up county level community wildfire protection plans. These are mandated mitigation plans that communities in high-risk areas have to create. And we asked, well, how to what extent do they use these kinds of 5 main land use practices? And those 5 land use practices were actually 23 individual practices grouped together. We did a systematic coding of those plans to see whether there was or not a strategy recommended. And then we normalized those scores and we developed a composite score for each county plan. So here is the first result. Just if you look at the mitigation plans, and this is the distribution of each of those mitigation strategies, the 5 types of mitigation strategies across various types of CWPPs, which is County Wildfire Protection Plan. And a high score means that there is a lot more more green means that there were more of those types of strategies to be found in CWPPs than, say, reds, which meant that they were not. And what you're seeing here is that there is, in fact, a mix of land use. If you were to look at it just comprehensively as a chart, there is a decent amount of green here, right? Which means that plans are actually talking about land use. But that green is not even across all types of categories of land use plans. So you're a lot more likely to see building level regulations, things like fire safe material, things like sprinklers, etc., or vegetation management, things like fuel reduction or fuel breaks, than we are likely to see subdivision regulations, which would be more like lot design, or zoning, which would be a lot more about, say, defensible space zones, or preventative land use management, things like buyouts or transfer development rights. So we're not seeing all types of land use here or land use strategies being reflected, but we are definitely seeing some. And the question is this enough? I mean, if we just did this, would it be adequate for wildfire resilience? And the answer seems to be no. And this, I think, really was exemplified in this article that New York Times had back in January about, in the California and the LA fires, there was this one household that faced almost no impacts to themselves because they had followed to the T everything that building regulations and vegetation management could have done. This is an exemplar case of they not only had defensible spaces, they had their own water supply. They went out and did firefighting on their own. They did all the fuel reduction around the house. They have a self off the grid home that can operate, energy by themselves. Here is a house that's built with fireproof materials, everything. And yet, and though they have zero impacts to the property themselves, here is a household in severe dilemma about whether they would like to stay in this location. And it baffles the mind. You would assume, having followed at least most of those land use practices at the building and the vegetation level, why would this household want to still move? And the answer is because communities don't just thrive on individual properties. Communities thrive as a collective. You live in places where there are other people, and you have an interaction with those other people. And this is why land use strategies at those other levels, the subdivision, the zoning, the community level land use strategies, become really, really important. From other research, which we have done before, we know that in the recovery process, people think of recovery as a communal concept. So even if they have not had a lot of damage themselves, they think of themselves as having had damage if the neighborhood has had damage, quite significant damage. And so their sense of how much damage they have is mediated by how much they perceive the neighborhood has been affected. And when they think about recovery, they think about recovery of systems that they depend on and not just their own selves. So this is a really good example of, hey, there is a disaster which has affected everybody but you, and you followed many of the best practices in the land use manual, if you will. And yet, because the land use practices didn't extend to the community level, you may still have doubts as to whether you will survive this disaster. There is another question that's raised. The question is, well, in the previous study, we looked at pre-disaster plans. And we hadn't gone through this experience before. Now we have gone through this experience. And hey, would having gone through a disaster experience change the way we do land use planning? Because now a lot more of this communality is manifested for us through this process. And there's a greater realization that there is an interconnectivity, right, between us and the community. So we set out to ask the same question. Well, if recovery has an important role to play in our risk perception and our risk awareness, would having gone through a disaster change the way we do land use planning, right, in our communities? So we set out to ask, well, recovery plans. Places that have experienced a disaster are making recovery plans. Do those recovery plans include wildfire mitigation strategies? And the answer here is mixed. The answer is, by and large, yes, but also no, because a lot of those communities are not making recovery plans. And it just tells you that there is a shift in how planning is done in general for wildfires. That, in fact, wildfire recovery generally does not include recovery plans, which is quite a red flag for us, because planning in general is about thoughtful development of your community. When you do not have a recovery plan, you're not thinking as thoughtfully, as comprehensively, as moderately about the long-term kinds of growth or aspirations that you have for your community and what kind of strategies you should be using. So overall, first of all, just not enough recovery plans. Of the 150 communities that we could have studied, only 10 actually had a recovery plan. Looking at those recovery plans, though, there is encouraging news. When they do make recovery plans, they do find there is a lot more of the zoning regulations and the preventative land use management. So going through the disaster experience does in fact raise awareness about the kind of land use strategies that we could use, and across all categories. It's still not reaching a lot of green. There's a lot more yellow here, which is they say in preventative land use, they might adopt one type of strategy, but not another type of strategy. That would be more along what yellow means in this case. So there is a higher, awareness and investment in land use in the post-disaster situation, but the overwhelming challenge is that people are not making recovery plans at all. And so there is still, therefore, a significant barrier to the promotion of land use types of adaptations in post-disaster situations. We're not making that sort of impact. And so here is the conclusion of what we are coming to here, is that we're just not doing enough long-term planning in wildfire community. We're not doing it in terms of, the kinds of strategies that we could adopt. When it comes to land use planning, we are neither thinking deeply. That is to say, for each category, we're not really considering all the options available within each category, nor are we thinking broadly the types of categories across various scales in the community that we could be adopting. And essentially, there are a lot more strategies out there than what we are using. And we are not seeing this before the disaster, and we are not seeing this after the disaster because we are not doing enough planning. And so at the end of the day, we are not making as much use of land use. We're not seeing that potential of land use at the community scale, not just the property scale, but at the community scale as having a role. We could balance what we want out of our communities with what constraints we face by thinking at that scale, but we're not quite thinking in that scale. And that we really need to start engaging in crucial conversations, especially given the loss of funding and the loss of protection mechanisms such as insurance. We really need to start asking ourselves how we manage our built environment in wildfire country, just so that we can be better prepared when that wildfire comes. And we will have a better sense of security and of resilience in the long run. I just want to say a quick word of thanks to a lot of people. This is the team that makes the research happen behind the scenes. We have a few publications out, and some more are coming out in the next few weeks and next few months on this topic. A quick thanks to the WAD Center, of course, and the Natural Hazard Center for providing us with funding. And I will take questions. So I have 20 minutes. I think it's 20 minutes almost to the dot. So I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you, Dr. Divya, for the great presentation. For the audiences, please feel free to ask your question. Okay, Dr. Esther, please go ahead.
Hi, good presentation, thank you. I noticed when I was reviewing the Fort McMurray fire in Canada that in the city of Fort McMurray, they had lots of communities with dense housing, but they intentionally left paths of forest to try to keep that part of the city green. And of course, people like to live near a forest. And it turned out those narrow paths of green that separated different parts of the neighborhood acted as wicks that allowed the fire to come in from the outside of the wildland for urban interface and actually get right into the heart of the city.
Yes, thank you for raising that really interesting question, because that happened in Marshall Fire in Colorado as well. The most expensive disaster in Colorado's history was the Marshall Fire. And the greenways actually created pathways, right, for fire to spread. And I think this is a really great example of when we do land use planning to really think about disaster risks in general. This is a slightly different question than what we're asking, but it is a really important one. Often, and I'm a planner, so I can say that with impunity, planners think of many ecological constraints when we plan. We think of water, we think of land constraints. We don't think of hazards as an ecological constraint. And it is about time that we started to do that, right? Floods tend to get a lot more airtime, if you will, as an ecological constraint, but not wildfire, not earthquakes either, things that are not that obvious. So I think that's a really great question for communities to ask themselves when they are making those plans and they're developing the land use plan, because a land use plan is not a land use planner sitting in an armchair and drawing things out. Land use planning requires community engagement and requires communities to come together and ask ourselves, how do we plan our community? And is this appropriate to put where this is? And then it is at that point that communities need to not only think of, wow, green space, I would love to live next to the forest, but also I am living next to a forest, which is going to burn at some point. And to have that conversation as to what that benefit and cost is, and then to make an intelligent and informed decision about that process or about that risk.
Yeah, thank you. If I can follow up very quickly, it seems that it's mostly the evergreen trees, the needles with the very oily resin and stuff that are the most dangerous trees. So I guess if Fort McMurray had cut down all of the evergreen trees and replaced them with deciduous trees, they'd still have the nice greenways paths in through the city, but with less chance of it being a wick to spread the fires.
And it sounds appropriate. I mean, I'm not sure as to what the ecological drawbacks are of cutting down all evergreen trees, but these are, and I'm not an expert myself in a specific tree ecology, but I would say that's a great kind of question to engage in, and also to engage the expertise of people who do this kind of work to say what would be the appropriate replacement of vegetation in a green space that would then also be a lot more resistant to wildfires. It's also possible that there could be other things like vegetation management happening in those greenways. Greenways could be designed to not have those trees. There's a lot that can be discussed. I think the broader point is we just don't discuss it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question, Dr. Divya. I just wanted to know, for the strategies that you mentioned for this plan, which one actually enforced in the real world right now?
Well, both the charts are exactly that. Technically, all of these strategies are in action everywhere. These are commonly used planning strategies. We use them both in non-hazard situations, but in floods, almost each of these strategies has been used. So for certain types of hazards, the kind of strategy adoption is very different. We looked at wildfires because we were not seeing the kind of adaptation land use kind of strategies being used in fires as opposed to floods. That's kind of the genesis of the project. We're like, well, flood, they talk a lot about TDRs, which is transfer development rights or property development rights, but there's no mention of it in wildfire situations. And we dug deeper and then we did this analysis. So a graph like this is really telling you that. It's saying these kinds of strategies are not being talked about in wildfire mitigation, but they are being used elsewhere for both other types of hazards, but generally in planning. So the short answer to you is they are all in adoption somewhere across this country.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Ali Reza, please go ahead. You are muted, I think. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry for, yeah, thank you for the great presentation. Yeah, I was curious about like the models or the studies that have been done for using land use planning, I know that the fire risk is considered. Just curious about the fire smoke impact. Like, we may have some communities far from the wildfire locations, but because of like terrain features or wind speed, we may have smoke that travels, and because of specific terrain features or wind speed and wind direction, a community can be impacted intensely by smoke that originated from the wildfires that are not necessarily close to the communities. Are these kind of like risks also considered in this kind of plannings?
In land use planning, broadly, yes. I would say in urban planning, broadly, yes. There are a few nuances here. I mean, consider that urban planning is also done in places with high air pollution, right? And that has a very similar effect to smoke. So the migrating smoke is a sort of newer risk that communities are facing, but communities have faced air pollution risk for generations, right? And so when communities plan, they think about air pollution risk generally. I live in Salt Lake City, for example. We have significant amounts of inversion in the winter. There's a lot of planning around what we should be doing. So as a result of that, there's a lot more transit planning. There's a lot more public transit, right? As opposed to, say, highway development. And highway development kind of things would also be land use planning. And so there are, of course, strategies generally in land use planning that accommodate for or try to mitigate against air pollution risks. I don't know to what extent newly emerging smoke migration from fires has been used for land use planning, but I can imagine that it will start becoming a really important question. Now, there's another nuance here. In none of this am I saying that communities should just up and move, because it's very hard, and we have learned this again and again through other hazards. Communities, for instance, that have high flood risk don't always move from that location. There is an inherent risk rationality, a risk trade-off that communities make. For them, for example, the hazard that happens once in 10 years is not as salient as the hazard that happens tomorrow, which is food security, right? Or shelter security. So there are other types of risks that communities face as a development risk that they're balancing against hazard risk. The point I'm trying to make is that communities make these decisions every day. And when they're aware of these risks, they make different decisions. And so part of this is just to be aware of the types of risks that we have and the kinds of solutions that could keep you in place, not necessarily have to move you away. Or are you able to balance what your aspirations are for you and for your community along with managing these risks? It is a very hard ask for communities that have been here for 200 years to say, well, now you just have to leave. And some communities think of doing that. It's called managed retreat. It is actually one of the strategies in the preventative categories, is thinking about managed retreat. But managed retreat happens in real life, happens very rarely, and it requires a significant amount of community planning to ask where they should go and how they should do it. And if it is the community consensus and community desire to do that, then the outcome is a lot more positive. But from a policy perspective, it is very hard to force communities to move. I know that was not exactly the question you're asking, but when you see things like major fire smoke emerging, right, like migrating and like you get inversion every year, or when you have a lot more increasing fire threat, experts in hazards, like us, people who think about disasters all the time, the first thought is, well, why don't they just move? And the answer is they don't move because there are other kinds of risks that they face. And moving would exacerbate those kinds of risks. And so I don't have a great answer. There is the potential of land use planning for migrating smoke, for increasing fire risk for these communities. The exact strategy that communities use is an algorithm that only the community can come up with.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, this kind of impact has no impact of like insurance companies or something like this. It's just have some social and health, impact on communities.
Well, if I can, Salt Lake City is an example. So we, like I said, we have inversion every year. Every year,
Yeah.
because we're a bowl-shaped topography, we have significant pollution in the winter. The heavy particulate matter tends to sit on us, and that causes, we have for generations had significant inversion problems in the summer, in the winter. Now we also have inversion in the summer because of the migrating smoke. The smoke that comes from California, Oregon, like turns around and like sits on us. And so we are at the city and then the state level, we are thinking about how we can use or adapt the kind of planning we do for inversion for the summer smoke. And so this is an emerging conversation, the same kinds of things that we think about for that, because we are adept at planning for inversion. We've been planning for it for many generations, years, decades now. And so there is a movement to think about what can we do for the same smoke days in the summer that we do for the winters.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hollis.
Hi, thanks so much. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm particularly fascinated by the when you were talking about your study that found that individuals see damage to their communities as damage to themselves. And the idea that particularly in recovery, people see like the recovery effort as like a communal objective. I wondered if you could talk maybe about any metrics that get used to assess like how well a recovery effort is going that would like speak to that idea that like an individual feels connected to their community in that regard. Mostly just curious about like how you take that information and then measure how it's going in terms of a recovery, or even like when you're doing the initial land plan.
Well, that's nothing to do with the land use planning. It's more in the recovery studies sort of thing, and I'm happy to talk about that. It's not the answer to your question is not in the study, anywhere in the study. But there are other studies that I do, and that's pretty much where my expertise is in post-disaster recovery. And so trying to understand what recovery means, and importantly, how do you measure recovery is an important part of that research. And in having been part of this field for a few decades now, I can tell you there is no objective measure of recovery. There is just none. You can measure different parts of recovery. You can measure where somebody gets their home back. You can measure the extent to which they get their job back. But at the core of it, recovery is an emotional process. And so in my studies, and not this one, but in other studies where we study recovery, we use recovery perception as the measure of recovery, the extent to which a person feels recovered at any point of time. And we do that because we know from an objective standpoint, you can have a house back but not be recovered. And you know this through qualitative research, which also I do. So if you went and asked somebody, hey, do you feel like you've recovered? They would have had, the house would be repaired, not unlike that example in LA in the fire. You have all the objective measures back. You still have your job. That person was an architect, and they were still an architect and a working architect. They had their job, they had their home. You would think that would be fine. But the answer was still, I don't feel recovered. Because there's a trauma aspect to recovery, which, by the way, they're not even addressing here. And I'll probably talk a little bit. The way we are addressing that in this study, the land use study, is that protecting yourself against damage prevents trauma. Right? So the less prepared you are, the more traumatic the disaster event is going to be. The more disruption there will be to the community, therefore you'll feel much less trauma. If there was a connection between recovery and this, it would be that you would have less trauma if only we were better prepared and more resilient. Right? And that's the one connection. in terms of recovery perception, we use recovery perception only because of that emotional aspect. And when we do our studies, we find that people, when they talk about their recovery process, they talk about it as much about themselves as much as they do about the neighbors and the community. So this comes out especially in interview research, where or like focus groups, where they're like, I'll give a clear example. We were doing the study in Hurricane Sandy in New York a few years ago, and we were talking to this homeowner who had pretty much comprehensive damage to their home. They had to rebuild from scratch. And we were sitting and speaking to her, and she said, well, I was all right. She said, no, I didn't have much impact. And we asked her, she said, I didn't have half the impact that person down the street had, which really tells you that when they think about their damage experience, they're thinking in relative terms. Oh, I was bad, but I was not half as bad as that. And so there is not just cognitively speaking, there's not just in recovery an individual level assessment of experience, but a communal level, a relative level of experience. And in the modeling work that we did based on surveys in the same places, both there and in Puerto Rico, we find that when people think about recovery, they actually rate neighborhood types utilities as having a significant type of impact on their recovery perception. When the neighborhood facilities are back, they feel recovered. They feel recovered. So this is really recovery perception. So there is a significant communality here, both in the sense of how people think of their own recovery, not just individually, but as a group or in relative terms, and how they prioritize the communality of that recovery experience as contributing to their own recovery perception. But like I said, in this study, that's not what we're focusing on. But I can sit here and talk for donkey's years on recovery studies, because that's a lot of what I do in outside of this research. So come find me, Hollis. We can
Okay.
have more conversations.
Okay, I will. Thank you.
Fatima, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you everyone, and thank you, Dr. Divya, for the great presentation. If there are not any more questions, we can wrap up the meeting here, and we will look forward to seeing you all for the next meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having
Yeah.
me.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
again. That was great.